Hello YouTube, first video of hopefully this successful YouTube channel discussions. Today we're going to be discussing a topic from World War II, which is probably the conflict which I love the most, history-wise. And today we're going to be talking about a tank. We're going to be talking about a very specific tank. We're going to be talking about the Cruiser A-30, known as the Challenger. A tank which was built and developed by the United Kingdom and used subsequently by the forces of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, the Czechoslovakian government in exile, and the Polish armed forces in the West. This tank was built primarily to the designs necessary following lessons learned in North Africa. In North Africa, through 1941-42, the British always had the problem of being massively undergunned. The Germans were bringing out Panzer IIIs armed with long 50mm guns, and by the end of 1942, they were bringing out models of Panzer IV with long 75mm guns. To put it quite frankly, the British, who were using pop guns by comparison, the old 40mm, I think they were referred to as 2-pounder guns, didn't really stand a chance. They would bounce off the panzers at long range and had to get suicidally close in order to do any damage whatsoever. The answer was hopefully going to come within the new models of tanks. Now, the British had been working on the development of a new cruiser tank, the Cromwell, for a while. This tank was meant to have a 75mm gun, and it was meant to have the new Rolls-Royce Meteor engine. This was meant to replace the Liberty engine which had been used in the old Crusaders, which was not very reliable, though powerful, and regularly required maintenance in the desert. During production of the Cromwell tank, there were concerns. What was discovered was that the German tanks were getting bigger and bigger, better armed, more heavily armoured, and were generally outmatching Allied tanks to such an extent that in some cases the advantage would sit totally with the Germans. Subsequently, an order was placed in 1942 for an A-30 based tank, and the order was placed to the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company. This new tank was meant to be mounted on the chassis of the Cromwell. It was meant to mount the new British anti-tank gun, the 17-pounder, a big 76mm gun of very high velocity. The tank itself, the Cromwell itself, had to be modified. The turret and the gun were placed in the hands of the Souther and Pitt Company. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The Birmingham Carriage Company had to modify the Cromwell hull to take this bigger turret that was going to be built by the Pitt Company. The design received additional emphasis when in May 1943 it was found in that the Cromwell could not carry its intended armament. Vickers had been developing a 75mm L50 caliber high velocity anti-tank gun. This gun, it was realized late in the design process that the Cromwell's turret ring was too small for this gun. The Challenger would be the only British cruiser tank to mount a weapon that could tackle heavier German armour until the arrival of the A-43 Comet. The gun it would go on to use is what we know as the 17-pounder. The British tank production was extremely limited. Of course, by this point, Britain has been subjugated to the Blitz for a couple of years. British industry has been hammered, and a lot of weapons were being brought in from the United States. Subsequently, when an order for 200 of them was placed and met, it was simply easier to convert Sherman tanks into the Sherman 17-pounders. Subsequently, by November 1943, Challenger production had stopped. The tank was subsequently rendered obsolete when Vickers developed a high-velocity 75mm gun, which was then subsequently developed into the 77mm high-velocity gun to arm the Cromwell tank. The Cromwell would subsequently make the Challenger, the Comet, the Firefly, and any other British tank at the time obsolete until the introduction of the Centurion tank. Now, the first Challenger was completed in September 1942, only 8 months after development had commenced. When they conducted testing, they found that although it was effective at long range against the best gun tank of the time, the Panzer IV, with the long 75mm gun, at shorter ranges the tank was still vulnerable due to a slow rate of fire and thin armour. The armour actually had to be reduced on the tank to first stop it from being front heavy, and also so that it could maintain the speed necessary to keep pace with the Cromwells. The Challenger, however, had also been developed in anticipation of a more heavily armoured vehicle. You see, the British and the Soviets had been following the development of armoured vehicles throughout the war, thinking that the Germans were getting bigger tanks, bigger guns, they're going to go for something huge and we're not going to be ready for it. The British answer was the 17-pounder, the Soviet answer would be the ZIS-2 gun. At roughly the same time that the Challenger comes into service, the Tiger I enters service with the German army. The 17-pounder gun would be more than capable of taking on this new killing machine. So what we now got here is we've now got some performance stats. We've got some performance and we're looking at, how the 17-pounder Challenger would hold up against other tanks. According to the according to the army at the time during the war, the Challenger offered significant performance against the majority of German armoured fighting vehicles. This is actually what they say about the 17-pounder gun when it was mounted on the Challenger. Including the Tiger I and Panther tanks, it had a higher top speed and cross-country mobility than the Panzer IV or the Sturmgeschütz. The arm of the Challenger, although it did offer very little protection against German anti-tank guns, was not that much different than the Cromwells which it operated alongside. During combat, the tank pretty much performed the same roles as the German Firefly, providing overwatch and making sure they could, keeping an eye out for other German tanks. His gun could knock out any German tank in service, with the exception of the King Tiger, whilst the 75mm guns and the Cromwells couldn't do it. The Challenger in combat was a very reliable tank. The Rolls-Royce Meteor engine made it far more reliable and far more powerful than the Liberty engines, which I said earlier were used in the Crusader tanks. However, it did suffer from one specific reliability problem in that the crews experienced that the track would get thrown, caused by mud building up in the wheels. However, according to the source, this problem was solved in time. Service-wise, they first saw service during the Allied invasion of Normandy. However, the vehicles themselves did not participate in the landings. They had to wait until the harbours were captured, such as Cherbourg and Mulberry, before they could be offloaded. The tanks were added to tank squadrons to deal with opposing heavy tanks, and many challenges were issued to units using Cromwells. The tanks were initially quite unpopular. Crews would complain about the lack of armour, the high silhouette, and the tracks being thrown. Troops used to the low profile of Crusader and the Cromwell found that the highest serious problem, although it was still shorter compared to the Sherman Firefly. Having said that, most things are shorter than American tanks. They tend to stick out like a sore thumb. Confidence in the vehicle grew, however, and in some cases it became preferred to the Firefly because of its lower silhouette, faster and more manoeuvrable attributes. The little bit of armour which the Sherman Firefly had became of no coessence when you realise that every tank gun that the Germans are fielding can knock you out regardless. The Polish 1st Armoured Division received several in mid-1945, and the 1st Czechoslovakian Armed Brigade used it during the siege of Dunkirk in late 1944. The Czechoslovakian government would subsequently go on to purchase 22 Challengers after the war, which was used in the Czechoslovakian army until they were put in reserve in 1951 and subsequently scrapped in 1959. Today there are 2 surviving Challengers in the service. One is at the Overloon War Museum in the Netherlands, the other is awaiting restoration in the Isle of Wight Military Museum in the United Kingdom until its closure. Once restored, this tank will be displayed at the Bovington Tank Museum, which is a fantastic museum. I recommend anyone who gets the chance to go. So that's pretty much the talking points about this cruiser tank, one of the last of its kind, and subsequently a tank which I feel doesn't get enough media output. Now, why this may be because there was only 200 of them, that could be a fair point. But I still think it's important to, look at these vehicles and think, why are they produced? What is their intended purpose? Were they just as effective as other vehicles used at the time? Because in my opinion, if you're looking at these machines, you may find that they're more effective than the vehicles actually being used at the time. Anyway, folks, that was, like I said, the Challenger. I've been Pay to Play, and I'll catch you guys next time. Anyone wants to have a discussion or anything?